Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, systematically shutting down the flow of news from the Iraq War. A child goes missing, and the family turns to the mass media to keep the story and their hopes alive. And state-run television teaches China how to fold its laundry. Welcome back to The Listening Post. We begin today with a story, elements of which we've touched on before, but it's a story that's changing. It's about the way that news is reported or not reported from Iraq. The Iraqi government's announcement that it will withhold casualty figures from the United Nations, its decision to bar reporters from the sites of bombings, and the Pentagon's new policy limiting its personnel from blogging on the war, that all adds up to an information clampdown on what is the world's biggest news story.
These are the victims. Our exclusive pictures show women in...
The numbers, the pictures, the words. If the Iraqi government and the Pentagon have their way, we'll be seeing fewer of all those things in the reporting of the war.
Well, as a journalist, of course, I'm distrustful of anything that attempts to restrict our ability to see and recount what has taken place. So naturally, I view it, and I'm sure most journalists do, with a good deal of suspicion that there is a reason that they don't want us viewing those things or telling people about them.
The withholding of civilian casualty figures, the fresh ban on cameras at the sites of bombings, and the new Pentagon rules limiting soldiers' war blogs, they all amount to a pattern. 4 years into Iraq's information war, the fog is rolling in.
For one thing, I think it will make the situation worse, because if the Iraqi government succeeds in stifling news coverage and stopping the media from reporting the true horror of what's happening in Iraq, the biggest losers are the Iraqi people. You can't formulate a sane policy on Iraq when people are not being given the full picture, neither the public nor policymakers.
Ever since the fall of Baghdad, when the U.S. announced it would keep count of American casualties, but not Iraqi civilians killed, McClatchy, a U.S. newspaper chain, has kept its own civilian casualty count. It still logs those numbers daily on its website.
If there's a bombing at a marketplace, there is always an estimate of the casualties, and it usually comes from the police. The health ministry is not giving out an aggregate of the deaths throughout the month, but there are sources for information on each individual incident. So we try to keep track of them. Now, we know we're not getting all the incidents, but we think, because we collect it in the same way every day, that at least the trend that we have is accurate.
New media are playing their part as well. One of the most comprehensive sources on the Iraq War is a site called IraqSlogger.com. It's an informal news network and an aggregator. Its co-founder predicts the ban on coverage of bombings is bound to fail, and given the nature of journalists, even backfire.
It might have the opposite effect of actually pushing attention to the bombing sites and the aftermath and the number of Iraqi casualties, because once you stop telling people these things, they seem to work even harder to find out what the real story is.
The advent of the military blogger has thrown a wrench into the information works. Soldiers now write and record their own accounts of the war and post them for friends, family, or whoever.
Today, is the story of the next big thing in Iraq going to come from the New York Times, or is it going to come from a soldier that's out there with a cell phone that takes a picture of something? And we've seen that time and time again where we've broke national news stories.
Most military bloggers are pro-war, but some soldiers criticize the Pentagon. This site, black5.net, carries links to YouTube videos that show the kind of armored equipment soldiers in Iraq say they need. Recently, the U.S. Defense Department issued new orders. Before blogging, soldiers must now get clearance from their commanders.
It's embarrassing for them when they have their own military saying, well, actually, hold on, this is what's happening. This is how bad it is on the ground. And again, the easiest thing for the U.S. government to do, since it's failing to actually improve things on the ground, is to stop people saying that things are getting worse.
I think it's going to be difficult for that cat to be put back in the bag. I don't think you can very effectively allow blogging, allow people to communicate quite openly and frequently with their families back in the United States, and then suddenly tell them they can't do it anymore.
The new restrictions on information come at a time the Bush administration is trying to sell a surge, its escalation of the war. But with so many citizen journalists covering the war, will that policy work?
We immediately sent up a network of locals who are trapped in their house but can communicate by cell phone, by internet, and they report on us, and everything as mundane as how many gunshots they hear, what a pack of cigarettes costs, what type of militias are in their neighborhood, and essentially becomes a more successful way of covering Iraq than doing it the mainstream media way, because the government is very adept at controlling the mainstream media.
Controlling new media is proving to be much more challenging. It brings to mind that old military cliche that the problem with generals is that they're always fighting the last war. Our Global Village Voices now with their take on the clampdown on news from Iraq.
I think the ban on US military bloggers is a real double-edged sword, because on the one hand it's backfired. It's actually drawn more attention to dissenting voices that are coming out on the internet, giving different perspectives on what's happening in Iraq. And it's a real shame, because if the Americans want there to be more understanding and perhaps more debate around what's happening in Iraq, then the example they've got to be trying to set is that they should be letting people speak out, even if some of the things they say is difficult.
Ever since the beginning of the Iraq War, the United States and its allies have done as much as they can to control the media coverage of the war. The reason for that has been that they know how important media coverage is to the successful prosecution of a military campaign. And it's really important when there are flaws in the justification for a war. They're also restricting access to reporters, denying them the ability to cover these bombings that happen every day. All this is intended to manage the media so that they can continue to fight what really is, apparently, a losing war.
If you have issues with global media and would like to be one of our Global Village Voices, then email us at listeningpost@aljazeera.net. We'll run you through the technology and teach you how to stop screaming at your television and start talking through your webcam.